Hello, and welcome to my course project, Impacts of Climate Change on the Chesapeake Bay Watershed. My name is Peyton Bean. First, we will start with an introduction to the challenges faced by the Chesapeake Bay watershed. So in this presentation, we will go over terms, data, history, effects and causes, and much more on the topic of climate change as it pertains to the Chesapeake Bay watershed. Not only does climate change affect our planet, it also affects our lives and communities. Through proven scientific data, we can enforce change and declare our role in coming up with solutions that aim to improve our delicate ecosystems. The Chesapeake Bay watershed is a wide range of water systems like coastlines, rivers, streams, etc. At 14:1, our land-to-water ratio is the largest of any coastal water body in the world, making the topic of climate change and how it affects this area of the utmost importance. Today, we will be covering how climate change is impacting this delicate system, along with understanding terms like forcings, positive and negative feedbacks, and more. It is imperative to go over and discuss exactly what climate change is. So what is climate change? A brief overview. Climate change refers to the long-term shifts in temperature and weather patterns. These shifts in temperature are brought on by many things such as forcing agents and positive and negative feedback. Like I said before, we will go over those terms later. So what exactly are forcing agents? Forcing agents for climate. So today we will discuss two examples of forcing agents and how they affect our watershed. Forcing agents are natural or artificial agents that cause climate change. So our watershed faces many forcing agents and is exacerbated by feedbacks both positive and negative. The Chesapeake Bay watershed is affected primarily by rising sea levels, a positive feedback that causes climate change through the melting of glacial ice, which leads to erosion and ice shelves. Changes in atmospheric content of greenhouse gases are also a cause of initial warming or a positive feedback. Negative feedbacks can help diminish another forcing agent of climate change, like land use, that contributes to the decline of the watershed. Land use in this case is especially important due to the delicacy of this ecosystem. Land use like crop production or factory farming is definitely a threat to the Chesapeake Bay watershed due to the leaching of chemicals such as glyphosates and other pesticides, as well as the contribution of greenhouse gases from farming. One way that negative feedback can help prevent further damage to this ecosystem is through the ability to absorb these pollutants, thus preventing further climate change. Now that we have discussed forcing agents, it's important to go over historical context of climate. Climate change has drastically changed in the Chesapeake Bay watershed over the course of history. There are some examples of climate change in the past, as well as some in recent data. So as an example of past climate, the first evidence of climate change in the Chesapeake Bay watershed could be noted as the formation of the watershed that started around 12,000 years ago, as a long network of rivers due to the end of the Ice Age. According to Maryland.gov, as the ice sheets receded, meltwaters helped to carve new channels, ultimately forming the Chesapeake Bay watershed as we know it today. Another past climate example would be from the past points to the arrival of the European settlers and their involvement in the rapid decline of the delicate ecosystems in our watershed. According to Maryland.gov, extensive deforestation, unregulated hunting, and other factors drove ecological imbalance, resulting in climate change factors. Now that we have discussed past climatic events that have affected the Chesapeake, we can take a deeper look at how those past climates have exacerbated temperature change over the course of the last 100 years. For our first example, NASA's temperature data for Mechanicsville, Maryland, shows us the trajectory of the temperature in this watershed. And then in the second graph, it shows an increase of temperature data for the coordinates of the Chesapeake Bay provided by the National Centers of Environmental Information. As you can see, after looking at these data sets, there is a steady increase in both average temperature for one isolated area as well as the Chesapeake Bay area as a whole. Now that we have discussed historic climatic events, we'll talk about regional and environmental impacts, which are extremely important. So unfortunately for the Chesapeake Bay watershed area, impacts of climate change are evident in many areas, including regional and environmental. As we have discussed, those impacts are especially poignant due to the region's delicate ecosystems. The Chesapeake Bay watershed is known for its vast wildlife, and unfortunately, these native animals, plants, and organisms are being displaced and impacted by a variety of culprits like deforestation, wetland destruction from development, and rising sea levels. Polluted runoff is another challenge that the Chesapeake Bay watershed faces when it comes to climate change. This not only affects wildlife and ecosystems, but the water quality for us as humans as well. Another very poignant area to go over are socioeconomic impacts. The Chesapeake Bay watershed spans over 6 states and is the largest coastal water body in the world. That being said, impacts on a socioeconomic level are of the utmost poignancy to discuss. One major socioeconomic impact of climate change on this area is, of course, fisheries and seafood. While overfishing and damage to the ecosystems are a threat, it is equally important to understand that climate change plays a role in this area as well. Climate change like severe weather, rising sea levels, development, habitat destruction, etc., impacts this industry by threatening ecosystems and marine life in the Chesapeake Bay area. Another major affliction of climate change on this area is tourism and nature-based recreation industries. According to the Chesapeake Bay Foundation, this industry brings billions of dollars in revenue to this area, which is being impacted by failing ecosystems, urban development, and habitat loss, as well as wetland destruction, which you can see below. Before we move on, I'd like to read a quote by the U.S. Senator and founder of Earth Day, Gaylord Nelson. "The wealth of the nation is in its air, water, soil, forests, minerals, rivers, lakes, oceans, scenic beauty, wildlife habitats, and biodiversity. That's all there is. That's the whole economy. That's where all the economic activity and jobs come from. These biological systems are the sustaining wealth of the world," which I think is super, super important to consider when we're talking about climate change and how it affects our area. So what can we do? There are many things that we can do after researching what we can do as far as what climate change does to the Chesapeake Bay watershed area. So now we'll go over mitigations and geoengineering actions. Now that we have discussed what climate change looks like on both a regional and environmental aspect, as well as a socioeconomic impact, we can further discuss what methods may be present or possible for the restoration of the Chesapeake Bay watershed. Many infrastructures are in place through the Chesapeake Bay program that afford efforts of mitigation that include restoring and protecting the natural carbon sink that is this ecosystem. These areas are responsible for the absorption and storage of carbon-related emissions, which is super, super important. Utilizing the Sustainable Schools outcome introduced by the Bay program that encourages schools, both public and private, to implement green roofs and solar panels to offset emissions. These are among many other things that the Chesapeake Bay program has implemented. The use of geoengineering as a way to act on climate change can prove potentially beneficial to the watershed area as well. One geoengineering method that may prove innovative would be reducing flooding and erosion by restoring and manipulating wetlands, oyster reefs, which are super important to this area, and underwater grasses to absorb wave energy, which prevent flooding and erosion. Another method that could prove worthy of further investigation would be tree planting initiatives and forest expansion to offset urban heat islands, as well as cool streams, rivers, and other wetland areas. So after discussing mitigations and geoengineering actions that may be possible for this area, it is important to look out for our future outlook of the area, which unfortunately for this incredibly significant estuary system, the future does not look very bright. Our beloved watershed is threatened daily, if not by the second, in terms of impacts from climate change. According to the Chesapeake Bay program, over the past century, Chesapeake Bay waters have risen about 1 foot and are predicted to rise even further, about 1.3 to 5.2 feet over the next 100 years, which is fast approaching. This is faster than the national global average because the land around the bay is sinking through a process called subsidence. This is extremely pertinent and demands action for our future, and it will look scary and much more scary than it does now if we don't act. And before we get into our summary and conclusions of what we've gone over in this presentation, I would like to thank you for attending this presentation, and hopefully this gives you some things to think about as far as our estuary system goes. After delving further into how climate change affects this very important ecosystem, I hope that we can come to a consensus on a solution. Moving forward, we must understand the delicate and poignant role that this estuary holds as it pertains to our climate, way of living, and the overall health of our corner of the world. Understanding terms like forcing agents, historical contexts, regional and environmental impacts, socioeconomic impacts, mitigations, and geoengineering actions, as we've gone over, as well as the future outlook for this Chesapeake Bay watershed, are incredibly important for the future of so many living things, not just us, but the ecosystem itself and the planet. Thank you so much for attending.